My name's John. I'm a UX designer at Google. I work on CI/CD tools for Google Cloud customers, including Cloud Build and Container Registry. So yeah, I'm excited to be here and talk to you all a little bit more about crafting user experiences for technical practitioners. So I've been working as a designer for about 15 years. Not always in this space. I've worked in projects for education, for museum and retail, for consumer apps. And for me, the kind of theme across it all has always been that I've been working on creating tools. Essentially, tools that empower people to learn, to make, to invite them to express themselves. So I'm sure, who else here identifies as a tool maker? Any tool makers? Oh, awesome. Okay, so we got, I'm sure, platform teams, pipeline wranglers, security tool operators. We got, I'm sure, everyone in the room. So I want to talk a little bit about user experience for tool makers, explore a couple of core principles and some case studies, and hopefully give you a couple of ideas that if you're not already implementing, maybe you can take away and apply for yourself. So to get started, I have a couple of things I wanted to get off my chest. Since this is Delivery Conf, I wanted to start with a little bit of a confession. So I've always worked as an interaction designer, but when I started out, I was a very bad front-end engineer. And I was thinking about my first job out of college as I was working on this talk, and these three tools came back to my mind with kind of a shudder. I remember like FTPing updates to PHP and .NET files to like make updates to site while kind of backing up every single copy of this into like a renamed folder with the date. Everything, you know, that this conference is decades beyond. VNCing into servers and opening up SQL Server and like editing the database files to make sure that things were changing. And so I needed to get that off my chest so that we can all start, you know, we're all friends here, start on an even playing field. And then I remember being at grad school, and as a designer, I've always been a little bit of a tinkerer, and I remember learning Git and discovering Heroku for the first time for a college project. And I was just blown away by its elegance, its simplicity, and its power to allow me to revert and redeploy at any moment in the context that I was already working in. So I think probably the challenge that faces many of us is that things aren't always this clean and simple. You know, stacks are never quite this minimal. Code bases have a whole legacy of change that needs to happen. Our teams have so much going on. Our desktops look a little bit like this. We have this growing list of demands. So optimizing the user experience of our CI/CD tooling is potentially, you know, pretty low on our priority list. But that said, I think the landscape is changing. The software engineers who are, you know, increasingly filling our offices and on our teams have grown up in a world that's eaten by software. Their everyday is and has always been in many ways filled with polished consumer user experiences, from their phone in their pocket to the Instagram feeds they're constantly scrolling through, the Maps app that's taking them from A to B. And they're starting to expect that of their developer tooling. So we've seen this consumerization of dev tools and a prioritization of UX and design. And it's not just because engineers expect it. Studies show that CI/CD tooling that integrates better usability and utility results in better outcomes for the engineering teams using them. According to Dora's 2019 State of DevOps report, the highest performing engineers are 1.5 times more likely to have easy to use tools. So these are engineers working on teams that deploy 200 times more frequently. They recover from incidents 2,500 times faster. And a part of that, a contributing part of that, is the usability of their tools. I think yesterday, it was the security talk I was at, and it was interesting in the conversation afterwards, someone brought up the power of developer experience to actually improve security. If the tools can make security more accessible, more integrated in my workflow, and easier for me as a developer, then immediately security can start to increase. So tools matter. Elegance, candor, and purity. These were a few words that a photographer called Walker Evans used to sum up the timeless appeal of tools as part of his photography in the 1950s. And I think this is another sort of area of overlap between designers and engineers. We are obsessed with our tools. And we can appreciate this kind of beauty, I think, maybe more than many others. And I think this elegance it's explicit in their form, but it's also implicit in the way that they're designed. Brett Victor, who's an amazing interaction designer and an engineer, he captured this when he described a tool as that which addresses human needs by amplifying human capabilities, sort of a base definition of a tool. So prehistoric man, he had a need to eat. He had the capability to aim and exert force, but he needed to amplify those capabilities with a spear or a sharpened rock. So tools leverage our ability to do more than we could do without them. And this sort of primitive task is really at the core of our design process. We take what people can do and we enable them to do what they want to do. So a great tool is designed to fit both the capability and the need, so both the person and the problem. And I think, if you think back even just to a simple tool like a hammer, the best tools, when they really work, they feel so natural. They feel so much part of your capability, they kind of disappear. So you're just aiming at the nail. You're not really thinking about holding a hammer anymore. The tool itself can often become invisible. And I think, this is the challenge, finding or designing the right tool that optimizes for both parts, both the problem and the person, in a way that causes it to feel natural to disappear. And this is kind of the core of user experience design, I think. And how does this happen, or why would I even want that to happen? So some of you, I'm sure, have heard about the psychologist Csikszentmihalyi, his idea of flow. So flow is a mental state of being completely focused. It's where we match the difficulty of an activity with their ability, their level of skill. So not so much complexity that it seems impossible and just kind of makes them anxious, but also not totally missing the difficulty level with their ability, and so we end up in this state of boredom. The key here is to keep people in this state of flow in the middle, where a user becomes so engrossed in the activity that she's unaware of the passage of time. I think coders know all about this. They live for this in many ways. And so we can think about maybe mapping out our tool to meet both parts of this. If it overly fits the person, then perhaps we're leaning maybe towards too simple an abstraction. Or if it overly fits the problem, then maybe we end up revealing too much of the underlying complexity. How can we make the tool learnable enough, but also sufficiently empower the task? So I'll get to this a little bit more later. But I think one huge part of it is maintaining context, is providing sort of a distraction-free experience. User experience designers, we're constantly thinking about those moments when we make a user switch context, switch page, switch screen, tabs. Every moment of context switching can be disorienting, can cause them to lose this state of flow. Google has done a whole bunch of studies on this, along with many other researchers in this space. And disruption is costly. Even a 2-second disruption can lead to a doubling of errors and it can take more than 25 minutes. I think they say up to 40 minutes if you're in a task like programming that requires heavy focus to regain that intense state of focus or flow that you had before the interruption. So great tools, they maintain flow. They're able to keep you in context. You have to go to where your user already is. So I think this is part of what made that first experience for me of Heroku so powerful, is that it was in the context that I was already operating in. I didn't have to go somewhere else with that. And working in this space, I think part of what makes it so challenging is that the user interface is not one user interface. It has, multiple parts to it, multiple ways in, multiple levels of abstraction for obvious reasons. And it makes things a lot more complicated than working on a maybe a more regular kind of consumer app. And developers are constantly, as you well know, switching contexts between these interfaces, between these tools, and every switch has a cost. How can we maintain context? How can we keep a user in flow? So one tool that we use is user journey mapping. So this is essentially looking at a user's experience as they undertake a task over time. So sort of determining where their pain points are. When is that unhappy emoji getting triggered? How are they moving between tools, and where are the moments of confusion and misunderstanding? And this can really help in identifying areas for improving user experience. And this doesn't have to be as pretty looking at a chart at this. This could be simply just observing those using your tools or similar tools. Go and sit with them, watch them, learn kind of like where those problem points are, where those moments are. And I think that's where we can see, just very simple solutions emerge, familiar things you're used to, where the information is brought to the user. So a pull request can build and test, run a full suite of tests and notify you of that status. A comment in a thread can approve the latest build for deployment. We're just making those tiny little optimizations that keep a user sort of in the context that they're already in, and we don't have to distract them and pull them out of that. Another example, a partner team of ours is working on a set of tools for VS Code and IntelliJ called Cloud Code, and allows you to do things like creating clusters and deploying them easily and in an ongoing way to Kubernetes right from inside your IDE. So right there in context, I don't have to jump out, but I can maintain that state of flow. So I want to take a little bit of a step back as I talk about this second point, and I want to talk about the most successful design, the most successful tool in human history. Any guesses what that might be? Fire's a good one. Kubernetes. Right answer. So Kubernetes is very close, but this is, at least when measured by product lifecycle, this model was the market leader for 1.5 million years. So this is the Acheulean hand axe, and it's believed to be the first designed object. The skills to make it were passed endlessly from generation to generation. Roman Mars has this great podcast on it. If you're interested, you should definitely check it out. But it marks this pivotal moment in human evolution when we started picking up objects around us and turning them into tools. So why was this predecessor to Kubernetes? Why was it so successful? Ease of use, perhaps. I think one part of it is that it was optimized for single use. So it had one purpose, one application, but you could craft it to your own specific use case. So experts believe that it was customized over time. It actually became sort of a representation of yourself, maybe a sort of social symbol. Apparently, there's some belief it was used to attract mates. It's called the sexy hand axe theory, which I like. And maybe I've heard some ops teams talking about their infrastructure in similar ways as they kind of craft it carefully.
I think that's what they mean when they say sexy hand.
Oh, okay. So This is another favorite tool of mine. When I was 12, I was obsessed with Swiss Army knives. And we were in Switzerland, and my dad bought one, and he said, on your 16th birthday, you can have this. But Swiss Army knives have this amazing appeal that they have everything you ever need in there. You're always prepared. You have your contingency. And yet, any of these tools, if you try sawing through a log with that tiny saw, it doesn't work as well as just a standalone saw, obviously. When you try and please everyone, you don't please anyone. I love IKEA's toolkit. It's just 4 tools, and it allows you to build pretty much 95% of IKEA's furniture. They've just scoped this down to the bare minimum, but enough to have huge impact. So they've kind of balanced this like focused utility and flexibility, and found this sweet spot. So great tools, they simplify complexity. Now this is kind of the bit I think maybe you expected to step into the room, and this is the designer was going to be pulling out Dieter Rams quotes like good design is as little design as possible. And maybe this is what you love or hate about designers, this kind of minimalism. Rams is sort of like the predecessor to Johnny Ives, to so much of the minimalism we see in technology around us. And you might think, yeah, that's great for consumer products or something that sits on my shelf, but not for the developers who are using my tools. And I think this, for me, has been one of the biggest challenges working as a UX designer in this space, is where to dial in this spectrum between complexity and simplicity. As I've said, I think the kind of minimalism that you see in a lot of consumer-facing products that makes an incredible user experience there doesn't apply in the developer tools space. And yet, at the same time, making every underlying possibility of configuration available, that's not right either. So how do we find this balance? One of our engineers on our team, he was talking to me and said that he thinks often other engineers like him working on platform CI/CD tools either design for like the super user who knows way more than them and knows everything, or the total novice who doesn't know anything, but no one in the middle. And so how do we design for those experiences, and also how do we design tools that moves a user from left to right, that grows with them, that can teach them and adapt? So one UX principle, I'm sure you've heard of the Pareto principle. It was coined by an Italian economist, and it's sort of applied everywhere in many different ways, also known as the 80-20 rule. But in a design context, one of the ways we apply it is you'll often see that 80% of your users are looking to use 20% of your features, and only 20% are looking for that other 80%. So in a consumer product landscape, often that means, okay, these features we're not going to prioritize, we're not going to ship, or we're going to find a place to put them that's sort of like out of that central journey. And I think for developer tools, it probably means more like that latter, making the most used features the most accessible, but still not removing those configurations or those details that will need to be used in certain contexts. I was talking to another designer about this, and they love that just like signal noise metaphor. Like, how can you dial up the signal enough that that's the thing that you hear amidst the noise? Whereas if you have too much noise, you just can never pick out that signal. So a little example of that. This is from some UI within Google Cloud's compute engine product. Initially, when this product was launched, users could dial in any possible configuration of CPUs and amount of RAM that they needed. But other than the super user, most people had no idea how much they needed. What do I need for my use case? And so a really simple, maybe obvious solution to this was just a set of sensible defaults that were created and labeled in a dropdown that you could select from. And if you were that edge case 20% super user who needed to dial things in exactly, you could still choose a custom option and sort of get that same UI to make adjustments. So 80% of users had a smoother experience, and the 20% who needed extra control could still find it, but they had to take one step further to get there. I think the best developer tools from a non-developer that I've seen, they simplify what's complex, but they don't hide that complexity completely. They don't remove it. It's not stripped away. So maybe I need to recoin this a little bit and say, simplify complexity, but don't necessarily remove it. Or optimize complexity for efficiency. Find that sweet spot to dial in that spectrum. In fact, maybe we could recreate our Csikszentmihalyi's flowchart with this in mind. Too much complexity can overwhelm users, slow them down, take them out of this state of focus. At the same time, too much simplicity, removing the lesser used but sometimes needed settings or configurations can result in frustration and equally take your engineer out of that state of flow. So we have to build in some room for growth, some way to design a path for complexity as we gradually move our users up and to the right as they grow with understanding. Another little example of this, this form was for creating a MySQL database within Cloud Platform. As you can see, a lot of page scrolling, a lot of options to put in place to just create that initial database. And not as many databases were being created as expected, and the design team went through an exercise, and this was the design solution that they came up with. So essentially, there's two form fields, two drop-downs, and then you have this advanced options button that will basically open up a bunch of other options that you may want to go into. And when this rolled out to beta, more users created an instance. There was less drop-off from that overall flow. And they went through really just a simple but interesting exercise. They essentially listed out every possible field within this form, every possible setting, and they weighed those fields around 3 core factors. So is this something that I can modify after creation? Yes, no, or that's a real headache to do. Does it have sensible defaults, or is there just no defaults you can possibly put in there? And then how critical or not is that? And then as they applied these weightings to every possible option in here, the ones that had the most, the ones that were sort of the heaviest, not modifiable, no default, critical, they kind of rose to the top, and that created that 80% path for the settings that customers most needed. And those other ones that were sort of falling to the bottom of that list were put in that design for kind of that 20% path. But we all know things are never quite that straightforward. So we can design for maintaining focus, maintaining flow, and we can try and keep things as simple as possible. But I want to potentially contradict myself with this final example, and this is, I think, how the design process often works. This is a UI before and then a redesign on the right-hand side from one of our ad-related products. And the UI is for selecting from more than 300 metrics to include in a report. You have a long scroll down through a page, which turns out to be maybe the height of my eldest toddler. And in 2016, the design team undertook a redesign and came up with this streamlined interface on the right. So it follows great principles to simplify this pattern. It sort of maps to users' kind of cognitive models of the content involved. But for users, the majority of users who were generating these reports several times a day, the new design hid things for them, and it doubled the time it took them to run a report as part of their daily job. So testing with users, usability testing, trumps everything. And that's at the core, I think, of designing great tools. Putting the user first in the process, and then also not forgetting to bring them in again at the end of the process. They're sort of there throughout. We're understanding and stepping into their world to understand what their journey is like, where they're switching context, where they're having pain points. We're determining how much complexity is right. But at that point, even until we've tested the design, it's just a prediction. Just like code, and untested design doesn't work. Just like that ad manager example I showed you a minute ago, designing with best principles isn't enough. we need to actually put this in front of users and see them use it. So maybe this is already a part of your process. For those who it isn't, you might not have access to UX researchers, and we have some amazing partners in our team who run incredibly in-depth usability studies. But here's just a couple of points if you want to start running some guerrilla usability studies with some of your folks who are using your tools. So first up, you have to find some people. Bribery works really well. Free food, desk toys, gift cards, whatever you can get, or even just the possibility of improving a tool someone uses every day, you'll be amazed how much that can be helpful to recruit folks. Then identify a task. So don't say, I need you to test this UI. You're going to invite a user to complete a task. So deploy a version of your app to staging. And this is really helpful because it tests more than your app. For example, they might start this task and go to jump into documentation and not be able to find the information that they need in the documentation. Or it might point to a problem with some other tool other than the one you're actually testing for. And so really key to set a task and ask them to undertake it. No hearts are going to get broken. There's no wrong answer. If you can get a third party who wasn't involved in building the tool to run this for you, even better. If not, you can kind of take a step back. I'm not sure if this is the right solution, so we want to test it with people. I'm not invested in this. My heart's not going to get broken. People can be biased towards positive feedback when they know that you've been involved. Just ask the user just to think aloud as they're using the interface, just to talk through what they're doing. Oh, I expected the button to be here. I clicked on it. Oh, that's not what I was thinking. I'd end up here. This would do this. Speak less, observe more, just take notes, ask questions. Don't guide them or grimace or up to the left, just move your mouse up there. There's a lot of that. There's no judgment, just reinforce. This is really helpful even as they make mistakes, as maybe you intended the UI to be used. And all you need to do is 5. Studies have shown that 5 is the magic number. After 5, there's minimal new insights gained. So just getting people for 5 people for maybe 10 to 15 minute studies where you observe them using your tool, super powerful. Synthesize that and roll that back into your next iteration. So in summary, great tools, they maintain flow, so they fit the problem and the user. They keep the user in context. They simplify complexity, but they don't entirely remove it. Think about that 80-20 principle and how you can kind of optimize for the majority of your users. And they put the user both first in understanding them, but then also last in running those usability studies to really ensure that this is working as best as it can for them. We have the privilege in engaging in one of the most ancient and empowering practices, making tools for people. So just a reminder as I close out, let's forget that our focus isn't on the technology itself or the tool. It's the ways that we treat, that we provide for, and ultimately that we empower our users so that they can go and build wonderful things with the tools that we give them. Thank you all for listening.
So, what challenges are you facing in this area?
Oh, right. Sorry, habits. I've been spending a lot of time chewing on the question of what the right form factor is. When I saw your MySQL, for example, that was super elegant and super clean, and I pictured half the users I talked to rolling their eyes and going, can't you just give me a config file? Why do we have to click and click and click?
Totally.
Super awesome talk, like kind of inspiring. So thank you. I think one of the issues that I know that people in my org are facing is we design a lot of command line tools, and it's really, really difficult to know what to show people and like how to like guide people. On top of that, it's sort of like there's sort of these old adages that we all kind of take for granted that like it should be small and simple, and like it's a Unix tool, right? So like it shouldn't do anything except for maybe one thing. But like in reality, we expect our tools to just be Swift's Army knives. So I think there's a lot of like difficulty in balancing all those things, and there's a lot of really cool talks out there on how to do that. But I think like a lot of the focus has been on UIs, which is super cool. That's where I go first for discovery. But I know command line tools are where a lot of us spend time, and that can be pretty tough too.
Yeah, so internally we have a private cloud in order to build virtual machines. Developers often have a hard time or take a long time building these virtual machines because of the cumbersome GUI from Virtual Machine Manager. So the DevOps team and I started building a tool, a command line tool to facilitate, make building these machines faster. With a config file, with like best practices and everything. But once we roll it out, no one used it because it's difficult to use as Kubernetes. So we're facing that challenge right now to drive adoption of that tool.
Hey, I wasn't really going to respond to him, but I want to mention that I am a designer, so I was so excited to see you here today. And I actually work in consulting, and I work with a lot of customers who are trying to evolve their product teams and incorporate this type of practice. So some of the biggest challenges I see is trying to help customers come up to date with the way and processes and all the quotes that were shared in John's deck, like using that kind of thing to get buy-in, basically, and to prove to them the value of user research and actually having designers on their product teams as part of delivery as well as research and development.
Hi. My big challenge here is when like infrastructure engineers or services engineers or developers and operators have fundamentally misaligned the definitions of simple, where the operator's definition of like a deploy is like is vaster and much more complex than the engineer's version of a deploy. And so when the operators control the tool sets, what happens if you get that triangulation wrong, operators make the tooling more complex in the name of making it more simple, but it's only more simple for the operators, not their users.
So I think in regards to tools as opposed to like end consumer type of experiences, one of the things that I've seen is what I think is the overuse of metaphor in design, and like even with modern tools like Kubernetes. And when engineers are trying to use tools to build things, generally when they start thinking in terms of these metaphorical mindsets, all of their solutions are in that framework, right? And it starts to remove creativity from a lot of their solutions because they're thinking in these metaphorical frameworks that the tools are presenting to them, when really if they just kind of took a step back and the tools were just very, very simple building blocks, then you'd start to get a lot more different solutions from different types of engineers and different types of perspectives, I guess.
Awesome talk, John. Can I start with a DAG joke? So I know the problem on your volume screen. The mute was a checkbox. It really should have been another radio button with 0 on it. So that would improve it because 0 would be the small volume. Dad joke. Two things. Don Norman's book, Design of Everyday Things. Please read it. Must read for everybody. You can see it all around it. So that's a flat door handle. Flat doesn't need a manual. If, God forbid, there was a fire, we would naturally press against it, and the door would naturally open. Bad design would be a door handle that you had to twist to push. You have seen those kind of doors, and Don Norman talks about a lot of things. My pet peeve, airplane bathroom faucets. 2 faucets, one says hot and cold, and then on international flights, also in French. If your faucet needs a manual, bad design. The other thing that I wanted to point out, which is one of my more recent passions, is affordances, which is also a Dan Norman thing. So Developers, of course, get Docker, Heroku, all of those things. Command lines are good. Think about people with disabilities. I have partial color blindness, so if you're going to put, if all the feedback you're going to give are red and green little boxes, I've seen those UIs, I'm going to need help interpreting that, and I'm a developer. And then, of course, think about people who have other kinds of motor disabilities, audiovisual disabilities, learning disabilities. So I think developers, myself first and foremost, are guilty of not providing the right affordances to all kinds of people. So those are my 2 contributions. Thanks again for a great talk.
Oh, hey, it's me again. One of the other things I think that was brought up in this talk that I think I got like a slide. It was good. It was great. But like something that I find that being one of the most important things to try to convey to folks who I'm working with is that like this 80-20 rule is sort of like a lot of what you're doing. Like you're going to make a lot of people very happy if you maybe don't include every advanced option in the get-go, right? Like there's going to be power users who will upset, and a lot of the times I think we get nervous about that, right? Like we want to add all of the features because like we want to make it a super general. We want to make the most general, flexible tool. Like that is what we've learned in programming. We don't want to make one bespoke, beautiful class that can only do one thing. But when you take that to sort of design, I think what you mentioned about like you will make nobody happy if you have this super general tool that no one can use. So I think that is, as like engineers and like people who are building tools, like that is something that takes courage to do, is to maybe like not build an interface for every single possible option. Maybe some things are just going to be in the API. Maybe some things are just going to be in like the advanced config, but sorry, it's kind of ramble, but I think that 80-20 rule is super important, and it's really hard to do, and sometimes it takes courage to do that.
Over abstraction leads to YAML. No, I'm the first to like YAML, but that's what I think. That's what sort of what happens when you want to satisfy every possible case, when you're not willing to sacrifice any unit of opinionatedness. You just reduce to, now I have a configuration language.
Okay, so over to success stories. Who has a success story?
I want to build on, what's his name, David, what David just mentioned. So he's talking about kind of the super user and kind of how do you prioritize your features. And whether you call it a persona or a profile or some other kind of topic of, you know, your user, I think the goal would be to validate and understand what the needs are of those users and use that to prioritize your backlog. Obviously, you're building a roadmap that's balanced with your business and technical needs, but that's what I found to be very successful, and it actually creates a lot of cohesion on the team where no longer are people arguing over what gets done first. It's basically like we're using our research data. So when John mentioned like the 5 people, like you've gone out, you've validated what you need, and then you're actually informing your backlog with that data, and then nobody's arguing about it anymore. It's like, well, that's what the users need, and so therefore that's what we're going to do next. I found that to be really helpful.
One thing that has worked, teams that I've been on and teams that I've been around, is tools should be easy to find. Subtle thing, that IKEA box, you don't have to wonder where the hammer goes. Again, the affordances thing, right? I mean, the slot for the hammer is pretty self-explanatory. So how do I find your 20 tools? Do you have a CLI? Do we have a -- help switch on top of that CLI that I can query? If not, then think about a tool as a tool vendor. If you've just made all these tools and they're hard to locate, well, then you have kind of made the problem in a sense worse, or essentially not solved it. So teams that have been around, CLIs with self-documenting, help, all of those things, they go a long way in making your tools actually usable as opposed to just useful.
So I just wanted to contrast. I was curious about why, and maybe we don't have time to get into a big discussion about, like, I don't find Git, the CLI, like, I know how to use it because I've been using Git for like 10 years or whatever, but like, I don't find it discoverable or obvious or whatever. And I would contrast that with, I do a lot of stuff in AWS, and AWS has released the serverless application model CLI, and there's also, so that is discoverable. So there's like, you do sam init, and that initiates a project, and then you do sam build. And the nice thing about that is that once the thing is built, it says, hey, the next thing you probably want to do is deploy. And here's the command to deploy the thing. And you can literally just copy paste it. So it's very discoverable, like what you should do next. So you ran build, okay, now it's time to deploy, and here's the command that would deploy your thing. And I find that incredibly useful.
Totally, and I think that's a great example of like understanding the core user journey that like 80% of your users are going on. You can pretty well predict what they're going to do next. So to the affordances comment, like put the door handle in front of them so they can like push it straight away. And I think that makes for a great user experience. And one other thought I had, just kind of commenting on what you said earlier, Darcy, and what you mentioned about the different teams. Another idea for exploring is just like co-creation. So bringing some of those different personas. If your op team and your dev team are using the tool in very different ways, like bring them both together as part of the design process so that they can get a sense of empathy for how the other person uses the tool and potentially be involved and feel like they have buy-in on moving towards that kind of better UX, maybe that simpler approach or wherever it is.
I'm cynically also going to say, in contrast to your praise of the very simple interface, give it 5 or 10 years. I mean, part of the reason why Git has grown so big is because it started off as very small and opinionated, and then we discovered new workflows, right? When Git was created, the idea that you would send everything to GitHub was not there. So like, words push and pull are backwards because their assumption about what, right, pull request, it's backwards because it has an assumption from 10 years ago that we've completely broken. Give your builder 10 years and it'll also happen. And I think there's an interesting question about when you refresh and throw out the old ideas and try again.
I think what you're talking about is validation. And I think that word works really well when talking to people on your team and kind of thinking about it and stepping out of your own shoes, getting away from your personal bias a little bit, it sounds like. And I think those things are really valuable kind of perspectives as a team to have as a mission. Like, hey, we're going to be in the shoes of our users, and therefore we're going to release our own cognitive bias of how the system should work. That's a very hard thing to do. And I think the empathy part of it is really the end goal. It's being able to understand each other.
Okay, the last part of questions. If you can predict, or if you have a wish list, what do you want to see in 2 to 5 years?
I want to see more open source tools built by clusters of organizations. I know I'm speaking to the choir, but Kubernetes is my best example of this. Kubernetes being worked on by AWS, Azure, and GCP all in concert has produced something much nicer. I know for a fact that like prior to Kubernetes, like every other company had their own internal version of this, and this makes everyone's life really, really hard. So I want to see more collaboration on tool sets like that build ops flows.
I want to see, in part, more of this. I am standing in a room right now with apparently 3 different people with the word design in their title who build DevOps stuff. And there's probably a bunch more on that half. And that's rare and weird, and I need to find you and build a network and get a conversation going about like what we can do that will help that world move as quickly as like the phone world has and the CLI world has, and yeah.
So when is Design Ops Conf?
I'll say that, well, I work for Red Hat, so the open source part of it, I should be able to own a little bit. And I think that what's missing in open source is bringing that cross-functional set of roles together. So it's really hard for designers and product managers, for example, to work in Git. It just isn't made for them. And so I have a personal mission in wanting to help bring roles together and make it easier for us as a community as a whole to be able to contribute.
Yeah, so this actually may be realizable, so it may make me look less stupid than all predictors normally end up looking in 2 to 5 years. ML allied with this is what you ought to be doing. So I think you mentioned Git is not intuitive. I like the fact that when you mistype something, it says, were you trying to type that? Which I think is a little bit, it's kind of if this, then that style predictability, but look 5 years ahead, you have a network of things. Were you trying to follow this workflow? You mistyped this. Perhaps you were trying to do that. Are you sure? And then maybe even suggest. So maybe a collaborative network labyrinth of tools that can guide users towards workflows by tapping into that ethereal machine language brain that we're going to build in the cloud. That's what I want to be in 5 years.
Wow, that's my.
So I'm really excited for the next 2 to 5 years. I think this is inevitable, but I'm really excited for us all as like people who build tools to like give up this false idea that developers and like the people who use our tools have like infinite angry cycles. Like we can build delightful tools for the people who are building delightful products for our customers, and like the people in this room, like that's definitely 100% the vibe that I'm getting. I know like all these different companies are working towards that, so that's what I'm really excited for in the next 5 years, like delightful tools for builders.
I think maybe we can, as you talk about sort of like ML finding its way in there, maybe we can move towards the Iron Man model, where we're interfacing with the tool in a way that it starts to learn and know us and kind of change to our form, grow with us, know what to suggest, know what our intentions are, so we'll all be in our CI/CD suits in 2 to 5 years. Metaphorically, sorry for the bad metaphor.
Okay. Well, round of applause for everybody. And that's a wrap.
Nice.